Well, good day, wherever you are. My name is GuyChristian AGBOR. I'm coming to you today to introduce my podcast, GOAL16. What is GOAL16? GOAL16 is part of 17 goals that were decided by the United Nations, right? It's basically, you could define, some people call Goal 16 SDG 16, which is basically peace, justice, and strong institutions. So it's this concept was developed in 2015, right, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development goals. Is to provide access to justice to all and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So Goal 16 has 12 targets. We are going to talk about those 12 targets that must be achieved, or I should say, should be achieved by 2030. So we are going to develop, conduct an analysis of all these 12 targets. Before I give you a description of all these 12 targets, please allow me to develop what the 12 targets are all about. But I should give you some facts that you should take into account. Among the institutions affected by corruption, or most affected by corruption, you have the judiciary and police. Corruption, bribery, theft, and tax evasion costs about 1.5 trillion to the developing world. But I'm also going to give you some numbers which, in comparison, right, when you compare those numbers that affect the developed world, because there is corruption and bribery, theft and tax evasion in developing countries. There is also corruption, bribery, theft, and tax evasion in developed countries, right? So I'm going to discuss, analyze both issues, right, in both places. You should also know that, if developing countries were able to get back the 1.5 trillion, you and I know that will go a long way to help folks living in these countries, right? So we are going to talk about some facts. You should know that birth registration that has occurred for 73% of children under 5, right? But only 46%, I'm sorry, of sub-Saharan Africa have had their birth register. So a lot of children don't get their birth register. So it's a problem for development. Should know that approximately 28.5 million primary school age who are out of school live in conflict-affected areas. That is another big issue, right? The rule of law and development have a significant interrelation and are mutually reinforcing, making it essential, very, very essential. In fact, it's one of the sine qua non condition for sustainable development at the national and international level. You should also know that the proportion of prisoners held in detention without sentencing has remained almost constant in the last decade are 31% of all prisoners. So we're going to talk about that. Violence against children. Violence against children affects more than 1 billion children around the world and thus costs societies up to $7 trillion, 7 trillion a year. So it's a significant, it's a big problem. So 50% of the world children experience violence every year. Every 5 minutes, somewhere in the world, a child is being killed by violence. 1 in 10 children is sexually abused before the age of 18. Now, 9 in 10 children live in countries where corporal punishment is not fully prohibited, leaving 732 million children without legal protection. All my good friends, all my colleague lawyers, we got to get involved in this and do something about it. One in 3 internet user worldwide is a child, and 800 million of them use social media. So any child can become a victim of online violence. So these are things that you guys should know. Now, for some of you who may be asking, who are curious to know why I'm doing this, this is my own participation to the good of humanity. I want this world to become better, and one way to do that is to be an active participant, in the dialogue, in the discussion, the analysis, and provide solutions through my research. And so we, during this podcast, I'm going to exchange with my guests a couple of knowledge, experiences, what need to be done and what is not being done. So, it's going to be a challenging discussion, but it's going to be a scientific one, academic discussion, but a down on earth discussion. We mostly are going to be practical. Excuse me. We're going to be practical. We are going to be practical. So let's talk about this 12 target that are part of GOAL16. So number 1 is 16.1. Countries must significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rate everywhere. 16.2. Countries must end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children, right? 16.3. Promote the rule of law at the national and international level and ensure equal access to justice, for all. 16.4 is that by 2030, countries must significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows. They must strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets and combat all forms of organized crime in their specific countries, right? 16.5, countries must substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. 16.6, countries must develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. 16.7, countries must ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision making at all levels. All right. 16.8, countries must broaden and strengthen the participation of developing of their specific countries in institutions of global governance. 16.9, by 2030, our country must provide, all the countries in the world must provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. 16.10, these same countries must ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreement. 16.8, which is the 11th target of Goal 16, is to strengthen relevant national institutions, including through international cooperation, for building capacity at all levels, right? In particular in developing countries, to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. 16.9, the last one, goal target number 12 of Goal 16, is that countries must promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development in their particular country. So I should note that it's not just a discussion that is going to cover policies. We are going to talk about facts, right? We're going to talk about what countries are doing right now. For instance, they are good. I'll put it this way: they are tremendous issues coming out of Brazil, right? Brazil is a significant country with respect to Goal 16, so we're going to talk about Brazil. Hopefully, I'll get in touch with some of my friends from the Federal Prosecutorial Office in Brasilia or Rio or Sao Paulo. We're going to talk about Peru, Nigeria, India, South Africa, Equatorial Guinea, Qatar, Congo, DRC, Angola. We are going to talk about most countries. We're going to give the chance to because I have to, as an intellectual, I have to be able to challenge these lawmakers, these governments, to what they are doing, in order to achieve these 12 targets. So there will be a discussion concerning what developed countries are doing. What is their understanding of Goal 16? What is their understanding about illicit financial flow? Because there are some a group of people who think that America, France, and the rest of these Western countries are not doing enough or doing too little against illicit financial flows. So we're going to develop, what the issue is all about. We're going to analyze it because even when I attend some conferences, within my network of anti-corruption fighters, whether they are from the corporate side or from the government side, most Westerners, some of them never even heard about illicit financial flows. So that is a big problem. How are we going to achieve that when people don't even know what you are talking about? Or they refuse to know what you are talking about. So it's something, this podcast would allow me to engage some of them and to push them to learn, maybe to be more, proactive. Some of them are doing a lot, but individually, not within the framework of what the United Nations wants people or, all of us to do. So, there is an issue that we need to talk about during this podcast, which is going to be the dichotomy of fighting corruption around the world, because there is fighting corruption. It's a train. It's a train where everybody that wants to fight corruption is on the train, right? But it has two different conductors going at two different speed, and they are going to two different directions. So I will not say it's not being coordinated, because at some time or at some point they do coordinate what their actions are when their interests don't mingle with their objectives. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the difference between the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index from the International Transparency International, right? Why that affects only developing countries. And we are also going to talk about what they call the Financial Secrecy Index, that affects developed countries, and that developed countries don't like to talk about, because you see, there is a symbiotic relationship between illicit. In fact, when I will be able to give you what the definition of illicit financial flows are within the framework of the United Nations, there is a thought, or there's a group of thinkers that believe that we don't have a universal definition of illicit financial flows, right? But I disagree. I will submit to them that they are refusing to acknowledge the obvious, right? Because illicit financial flows, talks about tax evasion, transfer pricing, transfer mispricing, and I think it should include tax treaties, right? In fact, the developing countries have to develop, I have already developed a new concept of international taxation for developed countries, okay? For developing countries, because the international taxation for developing countries is not the same as international taxation for developed countries. The OECD, hopefully I will have some guests from the OECD. I fundamentally disagree with their concept of defining what international taxation has to be, right, or is. I don't think that they are doing what they need to do to help our developing countries. But the OECD was not created to help Africa or to help other developing countries. So one might say it's legitimate for them to pursue their own interests or the interests of the countries that created that organization. So I'm going to be able to challenge them on the, because I think, in my humble opinion, Africa or developing countries in general, including India and other big countries, have to be able to develop their own concept of international taxation. Okay? You cannot globalize international taxation because the interests are different. It turns around one thing: the mobilization of resources to help each country where multinational companies are operating. We are going to talk about accountants, enablers, lawyers. We're going to talk about FIFA. Some of my friends in developing countries could not understand, even though some of them were happy, could not understand why the United States got involved with FIFA, why people got arrested. And, so we're going to talk about all those things. We're going to talk about the strong institutions, the African Union. We're going to talk about land and China, land in Africa and China, China and African debt. We're going to talk about kleptocrat, right, in developing countries. We're going to talk about the Magnitsky Act. We're going to talk about Interpol, the International Anti-Corruption Court, and the International Anti-Illicit Financial Flow Court. I'm going to try to demystify that concept of transfer mispricing and the concept of transfer pricing. Why I think the way it's done, we in the developing world should have our own ways of doing our own taxation, right? It should turn around. I mean, it should be raised around the issue of situs, meaning the country where the company is making money must be taxed by that specific country. And, I'm going to propose to make a lot of proposals in that effect. So we are going to talk about the AFDB, the current crisis with the president. This is a governance issue, an anti-corruption issue. We are going to talk about vulture funds. In brief, we are going to be able to address the issues of corruption and oil, right? So I hope that that I'm going to be able to exchange with you guys who will be following me, and criticism will be welcome, but they have to be civil and and constructive, right? So I am very excited, and I hope that you will be excited as I am. So thank you, and stay safe wherever you are, and stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.